Well, good afternoon. I'm Miriam Levin from the History Department at Case Western Reserve, and I'm so glad to see you here for this symposium on tipping points in urban change, modern perspectives on agents of urbanization. Before I go further, I just want to be sure to thank the Baker Nord Center for hosting us, as well as the History Department here, and the National Science Foundation, which have all been supporters and not just moral supporters, but financial supporters of this symposium. And I also want to thank Ann Helmreich, who's director of the Baker Nord Center, Linda Gilmore, who's done a wonderful job of making everybody comfortable, setting up the technology along with Taylor Hall, and just has been a wonderful resource for us. And also Callie Vimmer, who's an departmental assistant in history, who's helping us, as well as Marissa Ross, who's doing the books. So we'll see what the bottom line is for here, but we really are happy to be able to have this symposium, and I want to give you a little background before I introduce the speakers. First of all, the symposium comes out of a project that I organized with this NSF grant that involved 4 other scholars and the publication of a book. And you will see there are flyers for this new book that's just coming out called Urban Modernity, Cultural Innovation in the Second Industrial Revolution. There's a picture of the cover on the front. And we just got a mock-up of the book right here today. So the book will be out actually on book stands and on the web in a month. But we wanted to have the symposium now to celebrate it, and in part because our NSF grant runs out and we have to spend the money before the book actually appears. But it seemed a good moment when spring is coming to Cleveland as well. And there are order forms should you be interested in ordering the book in the back. But I do think that this idea of tipping points that we used in the symposium title is appropriate for giving you a little background on the book project and then the symposium. The idea of tipping points is that there's a point at which physically in physics, that some object is displaced from a state of stable equilibrium into a different state. It also has a sense that some circumstances which have seemed stable reach a point where internal changes force it to that stability to give way to chaos, disorder, and some kind of new order has to be established. And in terms of history and the history of cities, in our project for the book, and today too, there are certain historical moments in which there have been significant changes in urban life, and also vaster historical changes in which cities are big markers. And one of those significant moments came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when, in human history, there was this tipping point reached in which humanity began to be more centered in cities. The economies tended to be more based on manufacturing and industry, and the number of people engaged in agriculture to support human societies began to shrink. And that process has continued till today, in which many projections are that most of the world will be urbanized or involved in an urban culture before the 21st century gets halfway finished. So when we looked at this process of urbanization, as historians began to think about this period between about 1870 and 1930, when this first process of urbanization on an international scale began in certain cities throughout the world. And we decided we wanted to look at what are the agents of change. How did the disorder that came from this tipping point, out of this tipping point, become ordered into a new kind of urban life? And we looked at 5 cities, and we looked at the congeries of or clusters of activities that certain kinds of elites were used to make a new order based on science and technology. And those were museums, urban development, and international expositions. And we saw that there was a kind of conjunction and energy and dynamic among them that really resulted in significant urban creation of new urban kinds of urban living and existence. We looked at Paris, Berlin, Chicago, London, and Tokyo. So we then asked, in thinking about this symposium today, we've heard so much about globalization, global cities, postmodernism, post-industrialism. Was there a tipping point in the end of the 20th century that made urban life, that changed urban life and the character of it? Were there other places and other kinds of cities in the world that underwent these significant changes, and did they kind of fit our own, this broader description we had of this phenomenon? And finally, are there differences between these 21st century cities that are developing now, and particularly outside the West, and the first phase of this industrialization and urbanization in the end of the 19th and early 20th century? So the people we have speaking here today, I think, will at least raise some questions about this, present some information, and give some perspective to it. We have, first of all, Professor Marixa Lasso, who's my colleague in the history department. She's an associate professor of Latin American history, and she is the author most recently of a book called Myths of Harmony, Race and Republicanism During the Age of Revolution in Colombia, 1795 to 1831, and that appeared 3 years ago, and she's currently working on a history of Colón City in Panama. And she will speak today about defining modernity in the Panama Canal. And so that's a very, I think, a very nice way to enter this, because it's a colonial city that becomes its own national city. With Panama becomes national, we can look at some colonial circumstances. And the second speaker is Professor Robert Fishman, who's a professor of architecture and urban planning at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Professor Fishman teaches in the urban design and architecture and urban planning programs, but he is at heart a historian. And he is also a nationally recognized expert in the areas of urban history and urban policy and planning. He's authored several books regarded as seminal texts in the history of cities and urbanism, including Bourgeois Utopias, The Rise and Fall of Suburbia, and Urban Utopias in the 20th Century, Ebenezer Howard, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Le Corbusier. And his most recent work is on the exurbs, and he'll explain what an exurb is. And today he'll talk about the Motor City, the rise and fall of Detroit, a topic dear to my heart as I grew up there. And finally, our last speaker is Professor Peter Rowe, who's the Raymond Garb Professor of Architecture and Urban Design and University Distinguished Service Professor at the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University, where he's taught since 1985. He's also served as Dean of the Faculty of Design and Chairman of the Department of Urban Planning and Design there. And Peter is a practicing architect and planner, and he currently also is involved in the advisory council in the People's Municipal Government of Wuhan, China, and also he serves the UNESCO World Heritage Institute for Training and Research in Asia and the Pacific region. And so he brings a perspective and a knowledge, great knowledge on what's going on in East Asian cities. And his recent book include not just Asia, but Building Barcelona, a Second Renaissancia, is that? Renaissance. And Renaissance, yeah, thank you for the pronunciation. He's also written a book, a wonderful book called East Asian Modern, Shaping the Contemporary City, and is working also on a book, is this out now, is Projecting Beirut? It's out, okay. which examines similar questions about urbanization in the Middle East. So we're very happy to have that perspective in our symposium. And finally, there will be a comment and opening to questions led by Professor Robert Cargan, who's one of my co-authors in the Urban Modernity book. He is the Willis K. Shepard Professor of History of Science at Johns Hopkins University. And as I said, he's one of my co-authors on urban modernity, and he's also the author of a book called Invented Edens, Techno-Cities in the 20th Century, in which his co-author is Arthur Malella, who is at the Smithsonian Institution. So with that, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, Professor Lasso. The presentations will last about a half an hour, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And I just wanted to say, when you do come up, if you have a question, please come to the microphone. And then we will have a reception, which I hope you all can stay, and it will be further time to talk to our speakers and meet one another.
Okay, I'm Robert Fishman, and I'd like to thank Miriam Levin, Robert Cargan for the invitation to speak on this topic, which is dear to my heart. And this is central Tokyo at night. As it happens, I'm not going to talk about Tokyo, but I start with this image because I like it. And perhaps more to the point, what I'd like to do in talking about Detroit is to offer a kind of alternative genealogy of urban modernity to the, shall we say, canonical cities that this new book offers. And for those of you who are graduate students, I mean, I'm sorry for being so academic. In other words, the book isn't even published yet, and I'm already trying to revise it. But that's academia. So what I'd like to create, as it were, another category of urban modernity. This is Pittsburgh in 1905. And what I want to suggest is a category of cities that I'll call single-minded cities. Manchester in England, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Silicon Valley. And these are the cities that essentially use the lever of intense concentration on a single dominant industry, to use that as their lever to move the world. And I would say the mission of these single-minded cities is to accelerate history, to take an inevitable trend and to accelerate it through this extreme concentration, and hence to create their own kind of urban modernity. As we would say in Detroit, these are cities that put the pedal to the metal. Manchester, for example, in England, the first industrial city. Of course, it was once you had the kinds of technological innovations that were embodied in the early cotton spinning mills, such as Arkwright's that you see, a new way of production was going to come about. But so long as those mills were scattered in so many small towns, dependent on water power, this would have been a relatively slow revolution. But once you put them together in a great city like Manchester, you have this acceleration of change. You have the creation of a culture of change. And can this be seen by? Is that okay? It's only invisible to me, but that's okay. You're the ones who count. So you have the capacity to move the world. Or Pittsburgh. Again, it was perhaps inevitable once it was understood that in the American Middle West There were both the tremendous deposits of iron ore in northern Michigan, Minnesota, the tremendous supplies of coal in the Appalachian Mountains. There was going to be a great American steel industry. But it took the concentration of knowledge, of resources, of people with unique skills and drive in and around the city of Pittsburgh to really make the United States the great leader in steel production and make the United States, especially the American Middle West, the premier industrial region in the whole world. And Silicon Valley, I think, is the same kind of single-minded city. Well, we could argue whether it's a city. It's not a city in a traditional sense, of course, but it's certainly an amazing single-minded concentration of skills and knowledge that has accelerated history. And as I say, this is the context that I wish to place my discussion of the city of Detroit. This is the River Rouge plant, the great Ford plant, in fact, just outside the city in Dearborn, Dearborn, Michigan. And I think that Detroit is arguably the most important of these cities for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, what was produced. The automobile revolution that has changed our lives in city form, not least. Secondly, the mode of production, the introduction of the assembly line into heavy production, and perhaps most importantly of all, what is produced is a model of the industrial city itself, a inevitable model. This, in fact, is a map that was produced for the 1931 Siam Conference, the International Conference of Modern Architects, where it was displayed as the modern city. And this conception that the modern city is organized around large units of production, organized around mass production industries, a certain vision of this relationship, between the worker and the factory. I mean, Marissa's, I'm glad she showed those Diego Rivera murals, and though I might question whether that reflected the reality. In other words, I think that what Detroit was about, as far as workers were concerned, was about what seemed to be an historic bargain in which the worker gives up skills and freedom, in effect, to be part of this machine assembly process, and receives in return lifetime employment and high wages. And this was the modern world, whether it was in the Soviet Union, whether it was in Detroit. And as I say, this was what it was about. And Detroit, at its height, generated this. It was not only an archetype, but the city itself generated an amazing power compared to any other place. It was not only, for example, that in 1940, half of all automobiles manufactured in the whole world were manufactured within a 60-mile radius of downtown Detroit. This is Albert Kahn's great Ford stamping plant. But this factory is perhaps even more significant and more revealing. It's the Detroit Tank Arsenal, again designed by Albert Kahn. It was built in the years 1940 to 41, the very years when Adolf Hitler in Europe was terrorizing Europe, conquering Europe with a strike force of over 6,000 tanks, 6,000. This single factory, between 1941 and 1945, produces 25,000 tanks. That's a measure of the power that Detroit could muster at its height. And of course, as we know, Detroit has fallen from that height. Here is another picture, this time from Jose Luis Cert's book, Can Our Cities Survive? A kind of Siam manifesto published in 1942 of an industrial workers' neighborhood about 2 miles from the center of Detroit. And Cert captions this picture: a city should be something more than a monstrous and unending series of streets. Yes, I mean, GSD deans were pretty critical people. And here is an aerial photograph from 1949 of the same neighborhood, showing the pattern. This is a high school, an elementary school. The streets filled with small workers' housing. This is Detroit at the height of its population of almost 2 million people. Here is this neighborhood in 2003. Right. Well, and the view from the ground. So we've solved the problem of monotonous and unending streets. This transformation of the city, of course, is one of the striking falls, as it were. Detroit is now, of course, best known for its industrial ruins. This is the old Packard plant. A wonderful photograph by Camilo Vergara of one of the great movie palaces of downtown Detroit, now in ruins and used as a parking lot. This is Detroit today. And what I'd like to do this afternoon is to reflect a bit on the rise and fall of Detroit. And not just what is unique to the city, but also the issues, the power and the limitation of these single-minded cities in the creation of urban modernity. Okay, so this is again Detroit in 1940, the skyline at its height. How does Detroit become Detroit? Why does this single city come to dominate? Why did it come to dominate the automobile industry, the great automobile industry? If you go back to the 1890s, Detroit was one of a number of lake ports, river ports. It had a certain concentration in steam engines, in the new gasoline engines for building of ships and so on. But it was certainly not a major center. It was certainly not a Cleveland, for example. And I think the reason, or one reason, it becomes the Motor City. In other words, the Motor City was going to come somewhere in this complex of iron ore and coal that is the Middle West. But there didn't appear to be, and I think there was no particular reason that the automobile industry would concentrate in Detroit. And here's it. This was the Detroit industrial sector, such as it was in 1890. And the reason, I think, can be traced to this, believe it or not, to trees. That in the 20 years before the rise of Detroit automobile industry, Michigan, central and northern Michigan, was the center of tremendous lumbering activities. The great white pine forests of this huge region were essentially completely cut down in 20 years. And this was an ecological disaster, but it made a lot of people rich. And here's the scale of this. I really hope these two, I don't know whether these horses or donkeys, I really hope they don't really have to pull that particular sled, but whatever. I mean, that leads to this, and to this. These are mansions along Woodward Avenue in Detroit. And for once, there was an elite that recognized that the gold rush was over, or was about to be over, and that they needed to hook up with the next big thing. Everyone understood that the automobile was the next big thing. And so Detroit was a place where there was plenty of what we would call today venture capital, plenty of money to invest. That was why, this is the Packard plant from 1905, a major automobile facility before Henry Ford really gets his start. I mean, it was this sort, it was the money flowing from the timber to automobiles that makes the concentration. But of course, one can't wholly ignore the factor of individuals and the particular genius, if that's the word, of Henry Ford, the young Henry Ford, whom you see, who was born just outside Detroit in Dearborn, Michigan. This is the shed behind his house in what is now downtown Detroit, where he first started building automobiles. A copy is lovingly preserved in the Henry Ford Museum. I just couldn't resist adding this. This is Steve Jobs standing in front of his garage where he started Apple Computer. And it seemed to me there's an untapped subject in American history, great garages in American history, but we'll explore that in another conference. So here is Henry Ford, riding on the car that he built in that shed or garage, and I think Ford, if you look back at Ford, it was as if he had somehow internalized, come to embody the whole ethos of the single-minded city. He understood it profoundly. And of course, the city, as I'll try to indicate, came to him. There was probably no other city in the United States where someone like Ford could go bankrupt twice. In other words, his two companies go bankrupt within 3 years of each other, and yet he finds the capital to build the third that becomes the Ford Motor Company. That's what I mean by venture capital. Here is the company where the very modest factory on Piquette Avenue, where he first builds the Model T. And the fascinating, this is one of the early Model Ts, and the fascinating thing there is that Ford, once he comes up with this archetype, with this model, he's really not interested in changing it much. He notoriously keeps producing something like it. I went too far here. He's notoriously not interested in, he produces it through 1927, and it wasn't even all that advanced in 1908. His whole idea was production in bulk, lowering the price, radically expanding the market. In other words, this was the ethos. This is how a single-minded city changes the world. That's what we're looking at right here. And of course, he moves to his Crystal Palace, as it's called, in Highland Park, Michigan, at what was then the edge of the Detroit metropolitan region, for production in bulk. Initially, he crowds as much as he possibly can, producing a literally inhuman environment. And then he comes to realize, or his engineers start to teach him, that you don't achieve production and savings this way. You have to revolutionize the whole way of producing the car. So, in other words, creating a linear system, turning the factory into a linear system of production that we call mass production, the assembly line. And this is what changes the world. But as I say, my larger point is that Ford could not have done this without the support of of the rest of the city of Detroit. He was not, by no means, the only automobile maker there, and I would argue that, this is downtown Detroit as it was in 1910, that the real center of the automobile industry in Detroit, the United States, the world, was not Henry Ford's factory, but this building right here, the Hotel Pontchartrain. And it was in the bar of that hotel that the leaders and would-be leaders and would-be leaders got together to drink, to socialize, to schmooze, to deal. This was what, in other words, this Ford could never have expanded production as he did without a whole network of suppliers, without a city that could produce the kind of skills and the kind of products that he needed. So there were not only these factories like Maxwell of cars whose names we've forgotten, the King 8, whatever that was. This is a more Louis Chevrolet, the racing car driver, and the first Chevrolet. But I think much more than that. If you look at the texture, the urban texture of Detroit, this is one of a Sanborn map, insurance map from 1908. What you see is this, what Jane Jacobs would call close-grained diversity. Lots of small shops, lots of different specializations. This is where I think the real strength, the big assembly plants existed because, or could exist because of this broad network of specialized shops and suppliers. That was where the innovation really was coming from. And this was where the human skills were being developed that made it possible for Detroit to become the Motor City. And I would argue that Ford then takes, Ford himself, this is Ford and his son Edsel, takes the key step in, as it were, destroying this close-grained diversity when he begins to build the River Rouge plant, 1916, 1917. This is a model of it. And Ford was, as is well known, a control freak of the most freakish sort. And the Rouge was essentially a way for him to separate for the Ford production system from the whole rest of Detroit, the whole rest of the country. The basic idea was that everything that went into the production of a car would be owned and controlled by Henry Ford himself. There would be no suppliers of anything who were not part of his network. So, the coal coming in is from Ford's coal mines. The ships are owned by Ford. The railroad is owned by Ford. He has his own electrical plant, his own steel plant, and so on. And this conscious attempt to separate and really to destroy that network. It produces some remarkable architectural artifacts like the Albert Kahn glass factory that you see here, the famous Charles Shaler photograph of the cross transit belts. I mean, this seemed to be the way forward for automobile production. It becomes the symbol of Detroit, really. But I would say it's a step backwards. It's a step backward from the real strengths of the city. But luckily, Ford could not really control all of Detroit. There was, here's the Highland Park plant, the River Rouge plant. In between was still this remarkable urban collection, some large plants of Chrysler and General Motors, but still the thousands and thousands of small ones. These plants begin to organize themselves, interestingly enough, around the railroad lines, so that Detroit becomes a kind of railroad city, as it were, moving out into the open land at the edge. In effect, what we see is a sort of linear city of massive plants and some smaller ones along the railroad lines. This is Mound Road, Groesbeck Highway. Here's a close-up of this, the railroad line, the big assembly plants, smaller plants also in this corridor, and then workers' housing on both sides. Very much a linear city going out from the city into the suburbs. The Kahn plant was along this Mound Road linear city. So too was the Detroit tank arsenal. And I would submit, I don't know, Robert, this will be, again, I'm presuming on Robert Cargan's book here, but I would submit that this was a techno-city. This was a real live techno-city, embodying in a strange way that principle of advanced industrialization with the greenery of these small houses around it. This was the payoff, as it were, of the Detroit industrial system, that synthesis of work and family life. This is one of the suburbs just blocks from the large factory. This is what it's about. Family, the house, the car, the lifetime employment. This is what Detroit was supposed to be about. And so the issue, I just want to use the rest of my time to raise the issue relatively briefly. What went wrong? Why did this inevitable system not last forever? And I think one of the issues, one point that I'd like to suggest is that, first of all, just to go back to the map of Detroit, that these linear cities, as I'm calling them, were a very dynamic system extending the industrial process out into the suburbs. And at least the initial abandonment, and arguably the most important abandonment of the city, took place in the years of prosperity. That this system was just developing so much wealth and momentum, both in the automobile companies and in the workers, that you could afford just to abandon the old city and rebuild it at the edge in this newer suburban form. In other words, it was a process of you didn't need the relative crowding of these old 19-teens and 20s bungalows. Those could be abandoned because there was the wealth to move to this new world. The other thing about this new world, is that I don't want to be too hard on this family. I just found this picture on the internet. I have no idea who they are, but this is a white world. In the suburbs that surround Detroit in 1970, that is 2 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, these were large industrial suburbs filled with automobile workers, over 400,000 people living in the four largest suburbs. Of those 400,000, 86 were black. I mean, think about that for a minute. And they are right next door to Detroit, which was already 70–80% black. I mean, this is apartheid on a level that South Africa never achieved. So Detroit becomes a place of extreme racial segregation and never really accommodates or learns to accommodate the great black migration to the northern cities, which should have and could have been a source of strength. I found these pictures. This is the famous wall that Thomas Agnew talks about in his great book on Detroit Origins of the Urban Crisis, where the FHA, when a builder at the edge of Detroit wanted to build a subdivision in, I think it was 1939, and it happened to be close to a little village of black people, the FHA insisted that the builder construct this wall separating the white subdivision from these older black houses. And I found these pictures of this literal wall that Agnew talks about. So this was, as I say, a critical element in creating this level of abandonment. In the end, the white population had the resources to flee, and there just weren't enough black people to fill up the spaces that were left. So you have this weird landscape of abandonment. These are all pictures by the great photographer Camilo Vergara. Right. And one last thing, and a big thing that that I bring up, not because I really understand it, but I think it's critical, and that is, this is Henry Ford and his son Edsel, 1938 or so, and as I say, I think Ford's decision, which then becomes inherent in what Chrysler is, what General Motors is, to in effect separate the corporation from the city, to starve that wonderful set of suppliers and small entrepreneurs, becomes in the end, I think, extremely destructive to the whole Detroit enterprise. And the seeming rationality and progressive nature of the large bureaucracies that replace it. This is the Ford headquarters in Dearborn, an SOM building from, I think, 1955. As I say, this, we thought that this was somehow superior to that. But I think the reality is the other way, that it's the close-grained diversity of the city that really creates, even in a single-minded city, the vitality. And it was the shutdown of this level of operation that is never fully compensated for by something like this, which is the GM Tech Center, designed by Ara Sarnan and opened in 1958. Somehow, this kind of research never compensates for what those little shops were doing. And what's striking again is that this is a map of major automobile facilities in the Midwest from 1986. As you can see, the Midwest automobile complex was still strong as late as the mid 80s, including in and around Cleveland. Not to mention Detroit. This is the Hyundai plant outside of Montgomery, Alabama. A totally different. In other words, this is what I'm trying to understand, how this plant can not only compete with, but be in effect superior to this, to this older system. Clearly. There is something important, this is what's called the Southern Automobile Corridor of all the automobile plants in the South. It's not as if we're not manufacturing automobiles in the United States, we're just manufacturing them in a different place, in a much more decentralized setting, and in a, what I think we've seen was this strange alliance between Southern right-wing politicians on the one hand and foreign automakers, be it BMW or Hyundai or Toyota or whatever, to in effect undermine the older Midwestern industrial complex, and to create this new highly decentralized system that generates its own power through a global division of labor. Again, it's a complicated system, and but I want to kind of introduce that final thought to you. And all these things together lead to the crisis of Detroit and of this particular single-minded city. Right, another Camilo's great pictures. It don't exist. A mural outside a rather humble auto wash shop, recalling Detroit's best days. And I just want to conclude not with this picture, but with a quotation from Robert Frost that I find appropriate, actually. It's from his poem, The Oven Bird. And he writes, the question that he frames in all but words is what to make of a diminished thing. Thank you.